Two police officers. Both shot. Both alive. Both able to point across a courtroom and say his name. 3 shell casings on the pavement in downtown Atlanta. All 3 from the gun in his hand. And the state of Georgia dropped every single charge. No trial, no jury, no plea, no probation. Tupac Shakur walked out of that building a free man, and he never served a single day for it. Now stop and think about how strange that is. It's 1993. A 22-year-old black rapper, already famous for being in trouble, shoots 2 white police officers in the street. There is no version of that sentence that ends well for him. None. Not in 1993. Not in Georgia. Not with his record. So what happened? What happened is that somebody finally checked. Investigators took the officer's story, laid it next to the physical evidence, and started asking simple questions. Where did the casings land? Where were the wounds? Who moved first? And then somebody asked one more question, a boring procedural paperwork question. Where did the officer's guns come from? That question ended the case, not weakened it, ended it. And it turned one of the men who got shot into a defendant himself. This is the whole story, and it is, without question, the most undertold chapter in the entire life of Tupac Shakur. Let's set the scene. Autumn of 1993. Tupac is 22 years old and living at a speed that would flatten most people. 2 albums out. He'd already walked off with the movie Juice playing Bishop, and he was so magnetic and so genuinely unnerving in it that people left the theater talking about him instead of the film. He'd done poetic justice with Janet Jackson. Whatever room he walked into, he was the most watchable person in it. He was also in a permanent grinding fight with the legal system, an incident in Oakland that started over jaywalking, a lawsuit, arrests, accusations, headlines, and a growing number of people with authority who had quietly decided that this young man was a problem somebody ought to solve. And he talked about it, constantly. In interview after interview, he said the same thing. They are watching me. They want me in a cell or in the ground. And when the report gets written, the report will say whatever it needs to say. A lot of adults heard that and rolled their eyes. 22-year-old paranoia. Marketing. Posturing. Hold on to that. Because in about 11 minutes, a courtroom in Fulton County is going to test it. October 30th, 1993. Tupac performs at Clark Atlanta University. It's a good night. The show lands. And afterward, he does exactly what a 22-year-old on tour does after a good night. He stays out. Now it's the small hours. Halloween morning. Downtown Atlanta is mostly empty. Tupac is in a car heading back toward his hotel, and he isn't alone. There's more than one vehicle. There are several people with him. And somewhere in those streets, his car crosses paths with 2 brothers, Mark and Scott Whitwell. Both police officers, though not with the Atlanta City Force. Mark worked for Clayton County. Scott worked for Henry County, 2 departments south of the city. They were brothers. They were white. They were off duty. And according to accounts given afterward, they'd been out celebrating. One of their wives had just passed the bar exam. It had been a long night of it. Remember that detail. It comes back. Now, here is where this story splits in half. And it splits hard. 2 accounts. Same street. Same 60 seconds. Completely irreconcilable. Here's the officer's version. They said they were crossing the road with their wives when a Mercedes came through and nearly hit them. They said the car stopped. They said an argument started. And Scott Whitwell would state, under oath, that as Tupac came toward him, he saw him pull a knife out of his jacket. In their telling, they're pedestrians, nearly run down, confronted by an aggressive stranger, forced to protect themselves and their wives. Here's the version from Tupac's side. They said that as they came down the street, they saw 2 men in the road with a black driver, that something physical was already happening, that the 2 men appeared to be beating or harassing him, that the men never identified themselves as police officers, that racial slurs were used. They said Tupac's group stopped because of what they were watching, not because of a near miss. And they said the first gun that came out that night did not belong to Tupac. Two stories. And in those first hours, only one of them counted because only one of them was being told by police. The shooting itself took seconds. Shots came from more than one direction. When it stopped, Mark Whitwell had been hit in the abdomen. Scott Whitwell had been hit in the buttocks. Both men went to Grady Memorial. Both were treated. Both survived, and both were out within about a day. Neither wound was life-threatening. Investigators recovered 3 9mm casings from the street. They also recovered a knife. Tupac was arrested hours later at his hotel. 2 counts of aggravated assault, one for each officer. He pleaded not guilty. Bond was set at just over $55,000, and he paid it. Now picture that arrest for a second, because it tells you something. There was no manhunt, no chase, no attempt to get out of the state. He had gone to bed. Officers came to the hotel and took him in without incident. He was exactly where he said he'd be. That is not usually how it goes after someone ambushes 2 police officers on a public street. It is, however, exactly how it goes when a person believes he did nothing wrong. And his account never wobbled. Not that night, not months later, not years later. He said he saw something happening to a man in the road. He said he stopped. He said the men never identified themselves as police. And he said a gun was pointed at him before he ever reached for one. Same story every single time. But so what? Everyone says they're innocent. His own lawyer went out in public and argued that his client was being prosecuted because of his race and because of the content of his music, and plenty of people rolled their eyes at that too. Of course, the defense says that. The defense always says that. Which brings us to the 1st of December, 1993. There's a hearing. The question in front of the court is simple. Does this case go to a Fulton County grand jury? And over the course of that proceeding, the official version of that night starts coming apart in public. And it does not stop. Crack number 1. The witnesses. The identification of Tupac as the shooter was nowhere near as solid as the headlines had implied. One witness who had identified him acknowledged in the proceeding that it had been dark and that the darkness may have affected what he was able to see. In a news summary, that sounds like nothing. In a courtroom, it's enormous, because this entire case turned on establishing exactly who did what, in what order, in the dark, in a handful of seconds. Crack number 2. The officer's own statements. Investigators had been holding the Whitwell's account up against the physical evidence, where the casings fell, where the vehicles were, where the wounds were, what other witnesses described, and it didn't line up, not on small details, on the central question: who started it? The evidence increasingly pointed at the version the officers had denied, that Tupac's group stopped because of what they saw happening to another man, that a weapon was produced by an officer first, that the shots Tupac fired came after that, not before. Investigators would come to describe it in plain terms: a Good Samaritan situation that turned into self-defense. And then came crack number 3. This is the one that ended it. At that same hearing, Scott Whitwell acknowledged that the gun he had been carrying that night came out of his own department's property room in Henry County. Sit with that for a second. Make sure it lands. A police property room is an evidence room. It's where seized weapons go. Guns pulled off the street in arrests and drug cases get logged, sealed, and stored. Those weapons are not sidearms. They are not personal firearms. They are physical evidence in other people's criminal cases, and they are supposed to be untouchable. That's where the gun came from. Removed from the property room, carried off duty, on a night out, into a street confrontation with a civilian. And that single fact did something no defense attorney could have done on his own. It didn't just dent one witness's credibility. It reframed the entire encounter. Because a jury that hears an officer was carrying a gun he took out of an evidence locker is a jury that has already stopped believing everything else he says. It also broke the shape of the prosecution's story. Their whole theory needed the officers to be the reasonable party. Ordinary guys, off the clock, minding their business, dragged into a confrontation by a stranger. A weapon pulled out of an evidence room does not fit that picture anywhere, and it raises a question the state could not answer in front of 12 people. If this was an innocent encounter between pedestrians and a passing car, Why was one of the pedestrians carrying a gun that was supposed to be sealed in a police property room? And there was one more thing running underneath all of it. Remember the celebration, the bar exam, the long night out. Accounts from the scene and from the investigation describe both brothers as having been drinking heavily, visibly so, not on duty, not responding to a call, not in uniform, out drinking, armed, at 4 in the morning. So stack it up the way the prosecution had to stack it up in December of 1993. Your two victims are also your two-star witnesses. Their account of who started it doesn't match the physical evidence. Your eyewitness identification has been qualified by the eyewitness himself. One of your victims was carrying a weapon taken from a police evidence room. Both had been drinking for hours. And the defendant's version, that he stopped to intervene in what he believed was an assault and fired only after a gun was pointed at him, is the version the evidence actually supports. That's not a case. That's a liability. The charges against Tupac Shakur were dropped. He was never tried for it. No conviction, no plea, no sentence, no probation. The case simply ended. And it ended in a way that almost never happens, because the collapse ran in both directions. Mark Whitwell, one of the men who'd been shot, he was charged too. The counts against him included aggravated assault for firing at Tupac's vehicle, reckless conduct, and making false statements to investigators. The man who called it in as the victim ended up facing a felony count for lying about it. Now, here's where an honest telling of this story has to stay honest with you. Mark Whitwell was not convicted either. The district attorney eventually dropped those charges as well. He resigned from the police force roughly 6 months later. Both prosecutions, the one against the rapper and the one against the officer, ended without a jury deciding anything. That's the real ending, not a triumphant verdict. A case that fell apart so completely that the state let go of all of it. And there's a coda that almost every retelling of this story leaves out. The Whitwell brothers went after Tupac in civil court, where the burden of proof is far lower than in a criminal case. Mark Whitwell's claim was settled out of court. Scott Whitwell's went further. And in 1998, 2 years after Tupac was killed in Las Vegas, he won a $2 million default judgment against Shakur's estate. A default judgment means the other side didn't show up to contest it, which by 1998 was not a choice anyone could make. So here's the final scorecard. The man who was shot walked away with a civil judgment. The man who fired walked away with no criminal record for it. And the case that should have been the easiest conviction of 1993 produced no convictions at all. So why does this one matter more than the dozen other Tupac headlines from those years? Because it is the only major legal fight of his life where the record came out clean in his favor. The New York case in 1994 ended in a conviction. The Quad Studios shooting left him with 5 bullet wounds and no answers. What happened in Las Vegas in 1996 is still, 3 decades on, an open argument. Almost every chapter of this story ends in ambiguity or in loss. Atlanta doesn't. Atlanta ends with the state of Georgia looking hard at its own case and concluding it could not stand it up, and with a police officer's weapon traced back to an evidence room he had no business taking it from. And now, go back to the beginning. Go back to what he'd been saying for years. He said he was being targeted. He said the story told about him would not be the true one. He said that when police wrote the report would say whatever it needed to say. He was 22, he was angry, and most of the adults in the room dismissed it as noise. Then, on the 1st of December 1993, in a Fulton County proceeding, the official version of a night he had actually lived through got tested against the evidence. And the official version was the one that didn't survive. He never got a moment like that again. Not in New York, not after Quad, not in Vegas, not in the 30 years of investigations and speculation and unsealed files that have followed his death. One time, the record got checked. One time, it came back his way. Halloween morning, 1993, a street in downtown Atlanta. If you want to know what happened 13 months later in a hotel lobby in New York and why he was in a courtroom the very next morning in a wheelchair, that story is on this channel right now.